Welcome back to another episode. And for this week, I have our first non-physician. Travis Messina is here.
We formed a business, as you know, called Contessa Health, but I ultimately sold that business to a publicly traded home health and hospice business called Messina. I got back into the fold, and I'm now at a company called Regent Surgical, which runs ambulatory surgery centers in partnerships with hospitals and physicians.
So how do people get into working with startups? How do you get your feet wet?
And so I always say, look, you really should sort of crawl, walk, run before you fully rip the Band-Aid off.
Welcome to the Interesting MD podcast, the show about what doctors do when we aren't seeing patients and how this can help us find balance and prevent burnout. I'm your host, Rob Beck. All right, welcome back to another episode. And for this week, I have our first non-physician in the podcast. Travis Messina is here. So I'm going to let Travis introduce himself. But Travis and I first met 2011, 2012, when Travis was actually my patient. And we would meet, talk every year. And he asked me some questions one time about what we're going to talk about and about being able to take care of patients in the home. And beyond that, he not only became my friend, he became my boss, and now back to just being my friend again. Anyway, Travis, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much.
Of course, Rob. It's great to be here.
Yeah. All right. So just give us a little bit of your background, if you don't mind, where you're coming from right now, where where have you been?
Yeah, absolutely. So today I'm dialed in from Nashville, Tennessee. Obviously, you know that, Rob, but for the listeners out there, the quick Cliff's Notes on my background and kind of what led me to where I am today, and I'll talk more about that. So I'm originally from Louisiana. I came from a family of clinicians. My father, grandfather on my mother's side, my uncle on my mother's side, they were all orthopedic surgeons. My mom got into med school and ran a lab, but decided to be a homemaker. And so I was kind of pushed away from medicine. And so I was always really interested in a career in sort of business or finance. And so I studied business, ended up making my way to Nashville, and did something completely unrelated I wanted to be an investment banker, but did something completely unrelated for a handful of years. Actually worked in the music business, but then went and got my master's degree, went back and did investment banking in Atlanta, and did mergers and acquisitions. And I focused on a lot of different industries, but had my first exposure to healthcare there and really enjoyed being on the business side. And then ultimately had the chance to kind of go into corporate, as we say, which was I left being an investment banker and went to a publicly traded hospital company called Vanguard Health, and I was responsible for buying hospitals. And so I did it. I love that company. I love Vanguard. Could have worked there forever. The company was sold to a company out of Dallas called Tenet. And at the time, I had the opportunity to join the chairman and CEO of Vanguard, a man named Charlie Martin, who's a mentor of mine now, at his family office. And he said, "Hey, why don't you come to my family office, help me make investments?" And I said, "I'm flattered." He's sort of a consummate entrepreneur. I said, "But I've got this idea around hospital level care in the home." And, being the entrepreneur that he was like, "All right, give me the elevator pitch," which I was completely unprepared to do. And so I had to do that. And he was like, "That's not a terrible idea. Why don't you come to my family office, help me make some investments, write your business plan. If it's worth a crap, I'll give you the seed capital," which is ultimately what happened. And we formed a business, as you know, called Contessa Health on January 30th, 2015. I was kind of the first guy. Grew it to a few hundred employees. We did a lot of things along the way, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I ultimately sold that business to a publicly traded home health and hospice business called Messina in August of 2021. And then after taking some time off, riding my bike, hanging out with my family, my two girls and my wife, I got back into the fold, and I'm now at a company called Regent Surgical, which runs ambulatory surgery centers in partnerships with hospitals and physicians. So a lot we can talk about: banking, raising money, entrepreneurship, ASC.
All those fun things. Yeah. So the reason that I wanted to have you on here is because we do talk about things that doctors are doing when they're not taking care of patients. A big part of this is entrepreneurship. It's startups, it's working for startups, it's developing ideas, it's leaving clinical care and going to work for major corporations. And you have an enormous amount of experience with all of this and working with doctors and dealing with doctors. And so I kind of wanted to just pick your brain, ask your expertise about how we do this and how you get started with something, and kind of just work us through from the beginning and then we'll explore some different things about what you're doing now and advice that you might have for us, and kind of things that you want doctors to hear, or that
Sure.
doctors should tell the business people, that the business people want to hear from doctors.
Got it. I mean, the first thing that I always say as a non-clinician, and as I said, I came from a family of clinicians, they always reminded me that I was not clinical. They're like, hey, that's cute. You're not a doctor. The one thing that I always like to tell folks, and I remember having this discussion with you at one point, and I have it with a lot of folks that I have the fortune of meeting that are clinicians. It's like, look, are you sure you want to do this? Because, like, look, you worked really, really, really hard to get to where you are. You made a tremendous number of sacrifices to become a physician. And to walk away from the provision of care and taking care of patients, like, that's a big deal that shouldn't be taken lightly. Because I have seen a number of folks who do leave the bedside, for lack of a better description, and they regret it. Now, a lot of people love it, but
Right.
a lot of people are like, hey, there is that mission element of becoming a physician. And when you walk away from that, like, there's a void, there's a gap that can't be filled. And so I always say, like, look, you really should sort of crawl, walk, run before you fully rip the Band-Aid off and make a decision to leave the clinical side. Now, a number of people are able to do both. They'll keep clinic hours, they'll still do things to kind of stay relevant, but I always lead with that first and foremost. Whether it's a physician who's doing it or an entrepreneur, I have always focused, and like, look, I had a lot of luck, and like I always say that I Forrest Gumped my way through Contessa. It's like, I'm going to run a little bit, I'm going to do some shrimping, and voila, it happened. One thing that I always really implore people to focus on when they're coming up with an idea is to say, like, look, is this a true company? Or are you creating a solution to a problem that doesn't exist? Right?
Yep.
Because if it is a true company, like, then your odds of being successful, and success can be defined in a number of different ways, are much, much greater. Right? And so, like, that can be boiled down to sort of, is there a true product market fit? Is there a very large addressable market? And ultimately, is there a business out of this? Because so many times people think of something, they create something like, that's a nice to have. It's not a need to have. Or another description that's come is like, hey, that's a feature. That's not a company. That's not a business. And so I think those are that is all kind of encapsulated in one premise of, does the thing that you're creating have sustainability? So I'll pause there, see if that makes any sense.
So that totally makes sense. And so I think we can talk about different ideas of, what you have seen in the past. Is that a feature? Is that something that you really need? Or is that just something cool? Or, Contessa obviously was something that had a huge addressable market that needed to be out there. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? So,
sure.
And how that started, with your idea, and then how did you make that go from, because it wasn't just one moment where you thought about it and went in the next day and we're like, hey, Charlie, let me tell you about this. So how did that idea start for the people at home that have an idea? But let's walk through how you start to develop that, start to think about, is this a feature or is this a business?
Sure. And so I would say, I'm kind of a bottom line up front guy. That process is long. I think that from the moment I had the idea, and it wasn't an original idea. So it was, Contessa was focused on hospital at home, like the provision of hospital level care in the home. And we can talk about that from a clinical perspective because you wrote the protocols. This was something that had been around for many, many decades. No one ever created a business out of it. I had this idea, and it took about 2, maybe 3 years of doing research on the addressable market. Why hadn't this process or this business been brought to the market beforehand? And what did we need to do to really sort of, as they say, create a moat, kind of protect yourself and make sure that you have a truly differentiated product. So it was like a 2 to 3 year process of going through those market dynamics before even getting into, okay, what does the business actually look like? And what is the service going to be of Contessa? Ultimately, the main driver for me was a couple-fold. One, as someone who is responsible for acquiring hospitals, I would look at the performance of a hospital. And as I'm sure, as you know, as a physician who would round on his patients in the hospital, right? A lot of admissions are medical admissions. So like there are exacerbations of medical conditions.
Yep.
And a lot of those were things that did not require continuous clinical oversight, right? Like,
Yeah.
how often would you round on a patient? Oh, maybe twice a day, right?
Yeah. Once or twice a day.
And then nurses are checking on them, I don't know,
every couple hours, maybe every few
right.
hours, 6
And
hours,
so
depending.
if they have an infection, so they're getting IV antibiotics, and you're checking their vital signs every once in a while, and a physician is coming through. It's like, does a patient really need to be in a hospital to receive that same level of care? And so I started with the clinical to say, hey, and I remember this very vividly. I tried to call one of your senior partners because I was referred to your clinic by my in-laws, and they were like, oh, this doctor was like, oh, I'm full, but you should see this young, nice guy we got from New Orleans. I was like, well, that's great. I'm from New Orleans. I came in your clinic and I said, hey, you think if someone had a CHF or COPD exacerbation, you could treat them in the home? And you said, yes, I've done it before. I said, what? And you're like, it's called hospital at home. We did it in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And so making sure that you could deliver this service safely was mission critical item number one. Okay, well, now can you make a business out of it? Could you get paid? And historically, there had never been a reimbursement mechanism for hospital level care in the home. It was always done in grant-like functions. So then it was, how do you create reimbursement from a payer or a managed care company or an insurance company? So then I would ask the clinicians, I would ask you, okay, what would you need to render hospital equivalent care? And don't worry about it. Don't skimp on the clinical elements. You tell me what you need and I'll figure out the economics. And so then we came up with an economic model that would incent all parties to do so. And so then once we knew you could safely do the clinical provision, these are the economics, there was a value proposition for whomever was paying, i.e. the insurance company. Then it was, okay, do we think that there's enough opportunities in the United States for us to capitalize on this and make a scalable business? So that was sort of the threefold assessment that we did, over a many-year process.
Yeah. I remember from the first time that we talked about this to January 30th, 2015, it was a long time.
It was a very long time.
It was a fun and exciting time. All right. Yeah. So what you need is somebody, if you're a doctor, you need relevant experience. It's not that, I had done this a few times with hospital at home in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina with a guy with cellulitis and a few, other things, but that was born out of necessity. There was no hospital left. Exactly. So we had a bunch of nurses that were there, but we had no hospital. Exactly. And so I had the relevant experience at that time of taking care of the hospitalized patients, post-surgical patients, and those things. And I guess kind of dumb enough to do it differently and to say, I don't see why we couldn't. And I guess nobody else has done this. So, okay. So going back to seed money. So for doctors, yes, you need to have an idea. You need to have the relevant experience. I'm not going to open up a surgery center because I get hives when I go into an operating room. Like I tell all my patients, if I'm ever in the OR, don't go to sleep until I'm out. You don't want me in there. I don't know how it goes. I can't remember. And I'm okay with that. And my patients are okay with that. Yeah. So you need to have some relevant experience with it. Yep. And you then need to have the problem that you're addressing, obviously. And how do you go about, who do you talk to if you're a doctor? What's the next step, I guess?
I think having someone on the business side to be your partner, right? Doing it alone is really, really tough. I had a business partner in Contessa. He was not clinical. Obviously, we worked with you on a consultative basis. You still had your job of treating patients, right? And you weren't going to leave that. We understood that. But I think having a partner, especially one who is business oriented, is imperative. And not just because clinicians are more focused on the medical part. It's just that you need to divide up the responsibility. There's so much stuff to do. And secondarily, having someone who can be credible with the investors from running the business is important. And I don't mean that as a slight, but there were so many instances when investors would look at me, because I had never been a CEO, and they'd say, well, you've never done this before. Why should we back you? Thankfully I had someone who gave me my shot. And thankfully I was able to get to a successful outcome, which made it much, much easier to get the second CEO position. But so many times it's all about the team. And so before you do all these things around what your model is going to be, what the market is going to be, and so on and so forth, making sure you've got a good team is probably the most important thing before you go out and raise money. And so whether that's one individual or two other individuals, whatever that number is, only you will know. But having a team that can help you launch something is extremely critical, because the fact of the matter is the odds are stacked against you. I can't remember the exact stat, but it's something to the effect, Rob, that of all startups, 75% won't make it past the first year. And of the remaining 25%, only 10% will make it to year 5. And so the team is absolutely critical. And then once you have the team and you've done enough of your market research, then you can start to go to, fundraising sources to make sure that you get enough capital to get you to your first milestone. And so you need to know what's your first milestone, what's your second milestone, so on and so forth. And so I think that's the order. You figure out the business model, you figure out the team, then you go raise capital.
Okay. I mean, this can kind of go with, just to make this more applicable, it's not everybody who's going to start a hospital at home company and
Sure.
now you're in an ambulatory surgical center. But there are other people, there are doctors out there that, we've had friends and colleagues that have made orthopedic surgical instruments and ophthalmology surgical instruments. And in order to, for that doctor who's in the operating room and you think, I really need this type of catheter, I need this type of, device, it's perfectly fine. Go out there, think about what it is that you need. And again, is that something that everybody needs, or is that something that, only you need, or how big of a market is this? And then find somebody who can help you develop that, right? Like somebody that you trust. Is that?
Absolutely. And, in sort of pressure testing the viability of something, I always do the 0 to 1 test. So I didn't invent this. I don't know if I can plug books on here.
Yeah, sure. Go right ahead. I think it's only my mom listening, so it's okay.
I think it's Peter Thiel who had a book called 0 to 1. And so what the gist of it is, to make a truly valuable company, going from 0 to 1 is infinitely more difficult and more valuable than if you go from 1 to N, right? So, hospital at home, there had never really been a hospital at home company prior to there had been one attempt and it didn't make it very far. And so this was like doing something that had truly never been done. No insurance company had ever reimbursed for hospital level care in the home prior to Contessa. And Contessa was the first to secure that in the history of the United States healthcare system. I think that's
pretty cool. It's
pretty big
cool
accomplishment. And so that's going from 0 to 1. And so as you're thinking about that, does whatever your idea do, is it 0 to 1 or is it 1 to N? Is it something that's been done before and now you're just doing it, a little bit different?
Yeah.
And then, yes, you have to have people that you trust. I think the concern, and I had this, that someone's going to take your idea. Does that happen? Sure. Is it reality? No, because it's a lot of work to launch an idea and make it a business. And so I used to be maniacally worried about, they're going to take this idea and steal. No. Again,
they have to put in the same number of thousands of hours that you put into it.
Exactly. And so, there are also legal agreements that you can put in place that preclude people from doing that. So, but yes, having people that you trust is important. I think that gets to the team aspect.
Okay. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you. So beyond that, when you go for the money, what do people need to hear? So, I think I've told you this before, but when I was working on the electronic medical record startup that I was working on prior to working with Contessa, and this was all in my spare time. So, Travis, I did not ever leave medicine. Maybe would have been better for my patients. I don't know, but but we were working on electronic medical record, and we were trying to raise money. And, just being in Nashville, there's all kinds of healthcare dollars around. And I went and I spoke with a group of investors and I sucked. It was so bad because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what they were looking for. And I had no training. I had no guidance on this. I was put in there by myself with 3 guys who were super nice, but looking back on this, I just literally should have just died right there in the chair and have just not gone on because it was so bad. So
look, I've had those moments too. Everybody has those moments. It's tough. And you gotta recognize that a lot of these investors will have, I don't even know how many people pitch them ideas, thousands. Yeah. Tens of thousands. They have a finite amount of time. They have a finite amount of money, and they know exactly what to ask to determine whether or not they're interested in giving you that money.
So what are some things that you found helpful that the business people want to know? I don't know if you have ever been on the better side of the table in these pitch meetings or if you're always in the hot seat. So what are the things that you want to hear if you're a doctor and you're going into one of these meetings? Maybe you have your business person with you, but
first and foremost, you have to clearly and concisely be able to articulate what it is that your business will do. So many times people have a very hard time describing what it is that they actually do. And it actually took us, I think it took us probably many, many years to appropriately describe what Contessa did. And when you're doing something truly unique, it's hard to come up with that that descriptor in a clear and concise manner. So I think that's mission critical item number one. Two, how are you going to make money? Depending upon the stage of the company, some people are early stage, they're seed investors, they're Series A, as they call it. Which, by the way, Series A when Contessa did is a lot different than a Series A today. Like our Series A was a whopping $3.5 million.
That's seed money now.
I would even say that's seed money. I know angels that invest in that. But so you got to know how you're going to make money. And if you've never done it, having a clear articulation again of how you will make money is really, really important. Three, knowing how big this market could be, right? So that's what people call the TAM, total addressable market. So, okay, yeah, you do well. How are you going to take your portion of the addressable market? And I think four, knowing the competitive landscape. And the worst thing that you can do is say, oh, there's no competitors. Nobody does this. That just screams ignorance. So going through those four things, I think is absolutely.
A quick Google search of who else is doing this will.
Yeah. And the reality is they're probably going to know. If they took the meeting with you, they've probably already met with them. And so while it may not be a direct competitor, it may be analogous, you should speak to that. And I was always saying hey, no one does this today. There's a couple of grants that have done it, but these companies could get into it for these reasons. And it showed an awareness of the market. So I think those are the important things to know.
Okay. So thinking about, you already talked about this a little bit about doctors not really wanting to give up clinical practice. And some people, like what I did, when Contessa really started to take off, we started getting a couple of different health systems buying in. And it was time for me to put up or shut up, and I shut up. I said, I'm not ready to give up taking care of patients yet. Yes. And so I stepped back. So what are some ways that you've seen with people, and how do people get into working with startups? How do you get your feet wet? This might not be, other people that have been on the podcast have said, don't run away from something, run towards something. 100%. And that I think is pretty reasonable. And so how do people, if you want to start, how would you start? Maybe you just, all right, I just want to do something a little bit on the side here to start off with.
I think a natural progression is, there are a lot of entrepreneurial communities across the country, right? Nashville is sort of a hotbed for it because there's just so many healthcare companies that are here. And so it's easier for physicians in Nashville to scratch that itch, if you will, than it is in other cities. But look, Austin has it, San Francisco, New York, Boston, Denver, there's places all over the country that have this. And so, you can go into that local entrepreneurial scene and you have the National Entrepreneur Center here, right? You can go there, meet people who are starting businesses because the reality is they can't afford a physician on their founding team. And so they'll look for someone who may do it for equity. I couldn't afford to pay you an hourly rate. And then once I got it, I was like, okay, well, so I gave you a little bit of equity in the company. Yeah. And it was like, okay, I can actually pay you a consultant's wage. So then you can be a consultant and you can do it on the side. And then it'll get to a point where it's like, okay, maybe you're an advisor to the company. And then ultimately, being an advisor, watching the company go from infancy to maybe proof of concept to maybe, full client status, ultimately generating revenue, then a physician can make the decision, okay, yes, I like this enough. I'm intrigued enough by this idea, to your point of running towards something as opposed to away from something. They can decide. Now, the good news is that you can always go back to medicine. So, if I lose my job, I got to go find another job. I can't go be a physician. But I think having that consultative role, advisor role, do it on an ad hoc basis before, making the full jump is totally normal. I know a lot of physicians here in town. I think folks that from the Nashville physician community, they did that, right? They did what you did, but then they decided, hey, for one reason or another, they wanted to go into full employment with the company. And they've done so. And I think that they've really enjoyed it. But I've seen some that have done it and then gone back to practice. So it kind of cuts both ways.
Yeah. I want to encourage people. I haven't said this on the podcast yet, but doctors actually can fail forward. And it really is one of those things where if you manage your risk, I mean, my God, a doctor, not me, and I am not recommending this, but a doctor can literally show up drunk at work and have sex with a patient, and they will have their license suspended, but they will have a team of medical board, like the medical board will pay for them to go to treatment and will ensure that they can actually return back to work safely. Like, there is no other profession where that will happen. And it is because we are highly trained. Now, again, I am not suggesting you do this.
Yeah.
What I am saying is the system that we are in is fully surrounding us and helping us to stay in the job. So how does that work with what we're talking about and bringing this to something that is way less unprofessional? Is that, a group of guys, like there were four of us that wanted to go through and to make that electronic medical record company. We were all working on the side. This was our nights and weekends project. We put in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours over the course of about 16 months. The thing almost took off and then crashed. And all of us were still doctors. And all of us just went back to doing whatever it is that we were doing. And that I failed forward into Contessa, and that, I had a little bit more experience, a little bit eyes a little bit wider open. And,
when I said fail forward, that was kind of the description, not the example that you gave just a second ago. That never entered my mind.
Doctors don't.
I'm not going to agree with you on that one, but yes, I agree with you.
Do not do that, doctors.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who can be successful on the second or third go round, and it's just, do you have the intestinal fortitude to try it again? Yep. And, I'm biased, but I think that we had, and this is not just me, but I think at Contessa, Rob, we had a great team around us that enabled us to take it from idea to proof of concept to a scaled business.
Yeah. I mean, you were the hero of this story. You built an amazing team. You had an amazing idea, and you put together a great team. And that was really, really important. But again, for doctors out there, I kind of had to take a little bit less risk with Contessa because I took a lot of risk and lost hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours with the first company. And I was like, okay, well, that didn't work out so well. So I changed things a little bit and had a little bit less risk with Contessa, with a completely equally risky company, to be honest. And so there are ways to mitigate that risk to where maybe you're out, a couple of dozen hours, maybe a couple of 100 hours. But you don't have to just absolutely invest and throw away your career and remortgage your house to do all of this stuff. And so it's okay to take a little bit of lower risk. And again, for doctors, if it doesn't work out, go back to patients.
You've taken enough risk by taking out so much debt and going to school for so long to become doctors. I don't think you need excess risk. Put that on somebody else's shoulders. So.
Yeah, your $300,000 in medical debt was more than enough risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So what kind of skills are you looking for if you're a business guy, and what kind of skills, if you were an investor, you were a CEO of a company, what kind of skills are you looking for in your doctors?
That's a great question. I think it depends on the stage of the company, right? Like if you're in true idea formation, I'll just be very direct. You can't just pontificate or mill about smartly. You have to actually bring the ability to create and contribute to the building of the company, right? Yep. So I'll use an example, right? I came to you and said, hey, we want to do hospital level care in the home. How do you do that? Can you write the protocols? And you literally wrote the protocols for congestive heart failure, COPD, pneumonia, cellulitis, DVT, and I can't remember what the other one.
UTIs.
Dehydration, right? And so you wrote detailed protocols. And so being able to take feedback or input from someone on the business side and translate it into a clinical output is absolutely essential. So many times you run into clinicians that just want to talk about things and they don't put in sort of the effort to create the product or the output. I think that ability is absolutely essential, especially in an early idea formation stage. Now move forward. Okay, you're past idea formation. You're in sort of pitch mode, if you will. And I'm not talking about investors. I'm talking about in potential customers or clients, right? Being able to clearly articulate the why, not just the what, but hey, this is why you should be interested in pursuing that, right? Because I will never be able to sell a clinician because I'm not clinical.
Yeah.
And so having that ability to discuss that, and you did that effectively as well. I think that those are probably the two most critical skill sets when working with a physician. Now, when you get later and more established, we had a chief medical officer, Dr. Montney, who obviously, right? Like there are different skills and different things that we need to do as you continue to grow, and that's separate. But I think probably for your audience, those two elements are probably the most relevant.
Yeah. So just getting beyond the startups, because I do agree, like it was kind of in those weeks where I was writing, the couple of months where I was writing those protocols. I mean, it was like I was up at 4, worked from 4 to 6, got my kids up, took them to work, did all the things, put them to bed at 8, worked from 8 to 10, like that kind of stuff. Like it was pretty busy for a few months. And then beyond that, it wasn't as bad for me. It was much worse for you at that point.
It was way worse for me.
yeah, it was way worse for you. But what kind of skills are you looking for that next level? So, you talked about Mark, who is amazing, but he brought a totally different set of skills than what I had. And he actually is the one who I credit with taking the company from the medical side. Obviously, this was still you, but putting everything together. But it was a totally different set of skills from putting, those protocols in place to actually just developing. So what kind of skills do those people have? And what kind of, experience, how do you get that type of experience, or who are you looking for? I know that, I'd have to ask Mark, how did Mark get all of his experience? I totally get that. But like, what are the skills that you saw that he brought or that people like him when they were in Vanguard or Tenet or, even your current company?
Yeah. And I think like the difference in stage of the company then resulted in the need for like, you're no longer in idea creation or like you're not creating the product. Now you're managing the product. And so in our case at Contessa, since it was a clinical provision business, making sure that we had clinical quality standards and initiatives, and ensuring that we track those quality and satisfaction standards. We had performance improvement processes around those quality and satisfaction standards and protocols, and then constant, management of the outcomes with our partners.
Yep.
Is ultimately the skill set that was required, right? So like, how do you stand, like systematizing, if you will, and protocolizing, if that's a word. Yep. The quality metrics was absolutely critical because we had to ensure that patients' care was no worse than what they would receive in the hospital. So tracking that, improving upon it, communicating back to all the relevant stakeholders was a skill set that was absolutely essential. Also, in our case, it was really essential to have behavior change, right? Physicians were accustomed to taking patients who presented in the ED, failed the criteria for failed ambulatory treatment, yet met the criteria to be admitted, and they would send them upstairs into the hospital. Now we were going to send them home, and working through that behavior change was immense. And so he was instrumental in that.
Yeah. So earlier we've on an earlier episode of the podcast, it's getting that experience is kind of building up through clinic leadership, hospital leadership, getting on committees and learning how those protocols get developed, all of those things. And that's something that can be totally addressable somewhere else. What about MBAs? What about special training? What about special business training? Things like that. I'm not going to poo-poo MBAs because you've got one. So, but what about doctors and MBAs?
No, I mean, like I had to get one, and like that's a little bit ridiculous. But like I didn't go through the specifics. I said I did something totally unrelated. I worked in the music business for a few years, and so I went. I studied finance and accounting. I went to a summer internship in New York on Wall Street. I came back, and then I followed a woman to Nashville. She's my wife, so it worked out.
Okay, so it worked out. So
it worked out. But like there were no investment banking jobs in 2001, and so I went into the music industry. And so like I needed a job. And then it was like, okay, now I'm going to go back into investment banking. And I interviewed a couple places, and they would say like, what have you been doing for the last 3? You've been what? And they're like, no. And so it was like, getting an MBA is like a great way for folks to switch careers, or at least it was back then. I think the cost of an MBA now, and this is just my personal opinion, right? Like, and what you get out of it, like it's tough. It's really, really, really expensive, and the return on investment takes a long, 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 long time. So I always tell people like, look, if you're thinking about getting an MBA, like think long and hard if you're going to do a full-time program or an executive program. If you truly want to understand the various dynamics of, like how income statements and balance sheets work and all that stuff in financials, and if you want to understand marketing, if you want to understand strategy, I think it's fine. I don't think it's necessary because ultimately, like you have a team, and the team is going to bring their respective skill sets, and you have to lean upon those team members. And if you remember, I'm real big on staying in your swim lane.
Yeah.
And so at first, when you start a company, you kind of do everything. Like I took out the trash. I did it all. And that's the way it should be. But then, you're kind of all doers. Then you become managers of doers. Then you become managers of managers. And it's like, hey, this is your swim lane, like stick to your swim lane. And so you'll have someone to do those things. And people get their feelings hurt when you start uninviting them from meetings, but it's like, hey, we're a bigger company, and like, this is not the highest and best use of your time. So I don't find getting an MBA as being absolutely critical, unless you just have the curiosity and a ton of free time on your hands.
Just as all doctors do.
Yeah, sure.
Tons and tons of free time.
Yeah.
So for the doctor who's kind of not in Austin or not in Nashville, Chicago, if you were a doctor out in rural Arizona, rural Oklahoma, you have an idea. And, I do want to talk about your current business, if that's okay, but if you have an idea out there, what do you do? How do you, who do you talk to?
Honestly,
who do you think?
It's hard. It's really, really hard. And I think that's what a major contributor to that statistic that I referenced at the beginning of the podcast that says, look, like the odds are against you. Does that mean it's impossible? No. It absolutely does not mean that it's impossible, but it means it's much, much, much harder. And so when you are surrounded by folks that are supportive and they want people to see people succeed, and we actually had an event the other night here, and I have a lot of friends that have started companies, and they've, a lot of them have been very successful. And it's really weird in Nashville, you're surrounded by like a number of black swans. And I'm not saying Contessa was, but like I have a lot of friends that have had like outstandingly successful outcomes with their healthcare startups. And that's just not the norm. And so like having a community that supports that and can teach you lessons and show you the ropes and make introductions increases your odds of success. And so I'm not trying to be discouraging, but it's that much harder when you're in an environment where you don't have other entrepreneurs that you can lean on for advice. There's not a plethora of investors that can provide capital. There's not a bunch of people who are potential customers right out of the gate that are kind of surrounded. All of those things make it infinitely harder. And so I'd say seek out those communities to try and understand like what can you learn and try and find those that have been successful, because odds are there's someone in the community that was successful in the healthcare field or successful in an entrepreneurial role. Mm-hmm. I personally would be a little not skeptical, but hesitant if they're outside of healthcare, because healthcare is so nuanced, right? We've got compliance issues, we have insurance and reimbursement issues, and you have to be able to navigate those intelligently. And so having someone that knows healthcare is really, really important. That's why I think it's always important if you're a healthcare entrepreneur to have investors who have tremendous experience investing in healthcare. And as me and some friends say, they're not just tourists in healthcare investing. I think it's important to seek out those.
I did learn that there were so many other issues and things that I was just like, I just want to take care of patients and do all this. And you're like, well, it's actually kind of hard to get like narcotics out to a patient's house when,
Exactly.
It's like,
I think like having access to those that can help fill those gaps is really, really important.
Okay. So what are you doing now?
Yep. I'm with Regent Surgical. So we're an ambulatory surgery center company. So we partner with physicians and health systems to own. We're investors and we own in their surgery centers, but we also manage them on their behalf. So we provide all the management services and revenue cycle management services for sites that perform same-day surgeries.
Okay. And are you guys like expanding again? Just thinking, I'm not trying to get you to pitch, but for doctors out there that are considering this kind of stuff, what are things, because this is a different business model that people may be really unhappy with working, they say, well, I just really don't I'm not getting enough OR time with my hospital, or, I'm not happy with the fee schedule. Like, how do people start thinking about, because this is a totally different business model. And if you want to contact Travis and get him to build one, great, fantastic, go for it. But if you want to know what else is out there and how else this can be done, again, this is something that a group of orthopedists that are not in downtown Chicago or, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like that's kind of the beauty of the ASC model, is that it can allow physicians, and so many physicians do own their surgery centers outright. I think of the, round figures, there's probably 6,000 surgery centers in America, and only about 20% of them are owned by a management company like Regent Surgical. The balance are sort of owned by health systems or by independent physicians. And it gives you the ability to run your own business outside of your practice. ASCs are a tremendous opportunity to really sort of achieve the triple aim, right? A higher quality experience, a higher patient experience at a lower cost. As I talked to a friend in an insurance company, which, maybe take this with a grain of salt. I said, hey, how do you view the ASC industry? And he said, look, as long as I see a surgical procedure done in a hospital, I think that's a future opportunity for an ASC case. And I was like, well, I don't know that we're going to be doing cabbages in an ASC anytime soon. But, who knows? I mean,
right.
My father was an orthopedic surgeon. He told me the first time he did a total hip, the patient was in the hospital for 3 weeks. We do total hips and discharge the same day all the time at Regent, and we do so with outstanding clinical outcomes. So I don't think anything is impossible, but you always have to do it with a safe and effective manner.
Yep. All right. So when people are looking out there, they really need to think about obviously staying what's best for the patient and coming up with a good idea. And okay. Any advice to anybody who's thinking about doing this, who's thinking about starting up a company, anything last minute that you've thought of through all of this? Or if not, I mean, you've kind of thrown some stuff out there. So
sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about advice. Just you got to try it, right? I'm not saying quit your job as a physician and go start a company. I'm saying you got to explore the interests that you have, because odds are you will always regret not exploring it. And so I think if you truly are intrigued by something and think, man, this could provide some value to society in some way, shape, or form, you have to explore that. And even if you explore it and say, no, it's not for me, or if you explore it and hand it off to someone, or, if you explore it and it becomes the next publicly traded, multinational conglomerate, right? Like at least you did it. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, do not ever underestimate how insanely hard it will be. However hard you think it's going to be, it'll be harder, and it will take longer and more money. It always takes longer and more money than you originally anticipated. And that's okay. Know that going in, then it makes life that much easier. And then lastly, don't let it define you. So for the longest time, I thought that the success or failure of Contessa was going to define me as a person, and that couldn't be farther from the truth, right? There are so many other things that you all do. I mean, it's a lot easier for physicians because you take care of patients and you heal patients and you do amazing things. I didn't do that, but I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a brother, I'm a son, I'm a friend, those are the things that truly define you. And so many of us are so successful. I mean, you're physicians, you excelled in school and you finished medical school and you got your residency and all those things. And so failure is not something that you probably encounter that often in your life, if ever, but don't be afraid of it. I was terrified of it, but don't let that.
It turns out that your kids don't give a crap about what you did all day, and that your daughters do not care about, whether Contessa exited or not. Whatever. You're still.
I sent them a picture with me and some musician. They're like, "Oh my God, you met so and so," and that was cooler than
anything else that you will ever do. Yeah. Anything else you will ever do. Yeah. That's 100%.
But that and what you paid that and a couple, whatever the saying is, that and a quarter won't get you a cup of coffee at McDonald's. So
yeah,
it's worth what you paid for it.
Well, Travis, I really appreciate this. And I hope that at some point, maybe you'll come back on and give us some more insights into the industry. And if anybody wants to open up an ASC near you, contact Travis. All right. Thank you so much, Travis. I really appreciate your time. It's always good to see you.
Likewise.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Interesting MD podcast. Please check out my content on YouTube at Interesting MD and follow me on TikTok, Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at The Interesting MD and on X at Interesting MD. If you have comments or questions and want to get in touch with me or any of my guests, please DM me on socials or email me at rob@interestingmd.com. If you have any ideas for a show and you want to share your hobbies with me or don't know where to get started on your own project, you can email ideas@interestingmd.com. Please like and subscribe to the podcast and YouTube channel to get the latest content. Much appreciation to Falter Media for editing, producing, and posting all Interesting MD content. Check them out, because if they can do this for me, imagine what they can do for you. See you next week.